The night air was crisp as Officer Daniels drove down the quiet streets of the small town. The streetlights flickered over the nearly empty road, casting long shadows. It had been an uneventful shift so far, and he didn't expect much action. Beside him, Officer Reed tapped lazily on his dashboard, while Officer Carter sat in the back, sipping coffee. Then, just as they turned a corner, they spotted a sleek black car slowing down at a stop sign. It paused for a moment longer than usual before smoothly pulling forward. Officer Daniels narrowed his eyes. "That's suspicious," he muttered. Reed straightened up. "What is?" "That car stopped a little too long, don't you think?" Daniels said, his hand already reaching for the car's lights. Reed shrugged. "Maybe they were just being careful. Or maybe they're trying to act normal," Daniels replied, switching on the red and blue lights. The siren gave a short, sharp wail before the car pulled over to the side of the road. The three officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached the vehicle. The driver, a well-dressed black woman in her 40s, rolled down her window calmly. Her expression was neutral, her eyes steady. "Good evening, officers," she greeted. Daniels leaned down slightly. "License and registration, ma'am." She nodded and reached for her purse. As she did, Reed shone his flashlight inside the car, sweeping it over the empty passenger seat and the back. Nothing unusual. No sign of weapons, no sign of alcohol, nothing that would normally raise suspicion. But something about her confidence made Daniels feel like she was hiding something. The woman handed over her documents. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Daniels glanced at her license but didn't really read it. "You hesitated at that stop sign a little too long," he said. "Where are you headed?" She gave a polite smile. "I was just on my way home from a late meeting." Carter, who had been standing behind, stepped forward. "Mind stepping out of the car?" The woman's smile faded slightly. "Is there a reason for that request, officer?" Daniels folded his arms. He didn't like being questioned. "Just routine, ma'am." "Step out of the vehicle." A flicker of something passed across the woman's face, but she kept her composure. With a small nod, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. She was poised, standing tall, her movements graceful. She didn't seem nervous, which made Daniels even more suspicious. Reed took her purse and started looking inside, even though she hadn't given permission. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "I don't consent to a search." Daniels let out a short laugh. "Nothing to worry about if there's nothing to hide." The woman's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. "Officers, I know my rights. If I have done nothing wrong, I would like to be on my way." Daniels exchanged a look with Reed. He didn't like her tone. Too confident, too sure of herself. Most people got nervous when dealing with police. This woman, she was too composed, and that, in itself, felt like a challenge. "You're coming with us," Daniels finally said. "For what reason?" "We'll figure that out at the station," Carter muttered. Before she could protest, Reed pulled out the handcuffs and secured her wrists. She didn't resist, but her sharp gaze met each of their eyes. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly. Daniels smirked. "We'll see about that." They put her in the back of the patrol car, not realizing that within a few hours, the entire department and their own careers were about to be turned upside down. The police car rolled through the quiet streets toward the station. Inside the back seat, the woman sat calmly, her hands still cuffed, her expression unreadable. The officers expected her to protest, to plead her case, maybe even raise her voice. But she did none of that. Instead, she remained composed, as if she wasn't the least bit shaken by what was happening. This made Daniels uneasy. He had arrested plenty of people before, and most of them reacted with either anger or fear. But this woman, she was different. Reed glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You got anything to say?" he asked, almost as if he wanted her to react. The woman met his eyes in the mirror. "I've already said everything I needed to say," she replied. Daniels scoffed. "Well, you'll have plenty of time to talk at the station." The rest of the ride was silent, except for the hum of the engine. When they arrived, Carter opened the back door and gestured for her to step out. She did so with quiet dignity, holding her head high despite the handcuffs around her wrists. The officers led her inside, past a few other officers who barely glanced in their direction. At the booking desk, a younger officer looked up from his computer. "What's the charge?" he asked, typing as he spoke. Daniels hesitated. He had no real answer. He knew they had nothing concrete on her, but he wasn't about to admit that now. "We're holding her for further questioning," he said vaguely. The younger officer frowned slightly but nodded, continuing to type. Then he turned to the woman. "Name." She remained silent for a moment, as if deciding how to respond. Then, in a calm, steady voice, she answered, "You already have my identification." The young officer looked between her and Daniels. There was something in her tone, something firm yet controlled, that made him pause. He turned back to the screen and continued processing her paperwork. Next came the mugshot. Daniels expected her to look defeated, maybe even angry. But she simply looked straight into the camera, her expression unreadable. Then came the fingerprinting process. She followed every instruction without hesitation, her movements smooth and collected. After the formalities were over, Carter led her toward a holding cell. The metal bars creaked as they slid open. She stepped inside without a word, turning around to face them before the door locked shut. "You'll be here for a while," Daniel said, almost as if trying to provoke a reaction. But the woman simply smiled, a small, knowing smile that made something tighten in his chest. "We'll see," she said softly. Daniels turned away quickly, shaking off the uneasy feeling creeping into him. Meanwhile, inside the cell, the woman sat on the hard bench, crossing her legs and taking a slow breath. She knew this situation wouldn't last long. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And when it did, she would be the one watching them squirm. At City Hall, the mayor's chief of staff glanced at the clock again. It was getting late, and something didn't feel right. The mayor was never late for important meetings, and tonight, she had been expected at a community gathering. But she hadn't shown up, and she hadn't called either. That was unlike her. The assistant, who had been trying to remain calm, finally picked up the phone and dialed the mayor's number again. Straight to voicemail. A nervous feeling settled in their stomach. Something was wrong. The chief of staff turned to a colleague. "Have you heard from her?" "No," came the worried reply. "She never misses events like this. Should we call her driver?" "She was driving herself tonight," the assistant said, "but I'll try reaching someone else." Within minutes, the office was buzzing with concern. Calls were made to friends, family members, and anyone who might know where she was. No one had heard from her. That's when someone suggested checking with the police station. A city official quickly dialed the local precinct. The phone rang twice before a tired-sounding officer answered. "This is City Hall calling. We're looking for Mayor," the official started, but before they could finish, the officer interrupted. "Hold on," he said. There was a shuffle of papers. "Mayor who?" "The mayor of this town," the official repeated firmly. "She didn't show up for a scheduled meeting, and we need to know if there have been any reports of an accident or—" The officer on the other end suddenly sounded more alert. "Wait. A black woman was brought in earlier tonight. No ID except for a driver's license. Could that be her?" The person from City Hall went completely still. "What did you just say?" "We booked her a little while ago. Officers picked her up." "You arrested the mayor." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the officer muttered, Let me check something." A minute later, the line disconnected. Back at the station, Daniels was sitting at his desk, sipping coffee, when one of the other officers hurried toward him. "You need to come to the front desk now," he said, his voice tense. Daniels frowned. "Why?" "Just come." Curious but slightly annoyed, Daniels set down his cup and walked over. The young officer at the front desk looked pale. He held up the paperwork they had just processed. "This woman you arrested," he said, tapping the document. "Do you even know who she is?" Daniels scoffed. "Some lady who got mouthy when we pulled her over." The young officer swallowed hard. "No, she's not just some lady. She's the mayor." Daniels froze. He felt the words land like a punch to the stomach. "What?" "The mayor," the officer repeated. "You arrested the mayor." Carter and Reed had just walked up and overheard the conversation. Their faces drained of color. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Reed laughed nervously. "No way. That's a mistake." The younger officer shook his head. "It's not a mistake. I just got a call from City Hall. People are looking for her. They're demanding answers." Daniel's stomach tightened. He turned toward the holding cells, his mind racing. The woman, the calm way she had looked at them, the way she hadn't seemed worried at all. It all made sense now. She had known this moment was coming. Without another word, Daniels stormed toward the cells, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Daniels walked quickly through the station, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Reed and Carter followed behind him, their faces tight with worry. This had to be some kind of mistake. The woman they had arrested couldn't actually be the mayor. If that were true, then they had just made the worst mistake of their careers. As they reached the holding cells, Daniels felt a cold sweat on his back. He grabbed the key and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The woman was sitting on the bench, her back straight, her expression calm as ever. She didn't even look surprised to see them standing there, panic written all over their faces. Daniels cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice unusually stiff, "we need to talk." The woman slowly stood up, her eyes meeting his. "Do we?" she asked, her voice steady and controlled. Daniels hesitated. She was looking at him the same way she had when they arrested her. Calm, patient, like she was just waiting for him to realize how badly he had messed up. He felt a tight knot form in his chest. Reed stepped forward, trying to keep his voice light. "Listen, there's been a misunderstanding." The woman arched an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding." Daniels clenched his jaw. "Look, we—" Before he could finish, the sound of voices filled the station. Loud, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. Then the station doors burst open, and a group of city officials, lawyers, and the police chief himself walked in. The air in the room changed instantly. The young officer at the front desk jumped to his feet. Chief." The police chief ignored him, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on the woman in the holding cell. His face darkened. "Get that door open," he snapped. Daniels rushed to unlock the cell, his hands slightly unsteady. The moment the door swung open, the woman stepped out gracefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her coat. She looked directly at the police chief. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice polite but firm. The chief turned to Daniels, Reed, and Carter, his face red with anger. "What did you three just do?" Daniels swallowed hard. "Sir, we—" The chief cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Do you have any idea who this is?" His voice was dangerously low. "Do you know what you've done?" Reed tried to explain. "We thought—" "No," the chief interrupted. "You didn't think. You acted. And now you've arrested the mayor of this town on nothing." Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. He felt like the floor beneath him had disappeared. The mayor looked at each of them, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to the chief. "I assume I'm free to go." "Of course, Madam Mayor," the chief said quickly. "I deeply apologize for—" She raised a hand, stopping him. "This isn't the place for apologies." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. The room was silent except for the sound of her heels clicking against the floor. The city officials and lawyers followed behind her. Only after she was gone did the chief finally turn back to Daniels, Reed, and Carter. His voice was quiet but sharp. "We're going to have a long conversation about this. But first, you better prepare yourselves, because this is about to become a very, very big problem." None of them said a word. They didn't have to. The damage was already done. The police station was silent after the mayor left. Daniels, Reed, and Carter stood frozen, their faces pale. The weight of their mistake was finally sinking in. The chief rubbed his temples and let out a deep sigh, shaking his head in frustration. "You three have no idea what kind of mess you've just made," he muttered. Daniels swallowed hard. "Chief, we didn't know." The chief's eyes snapped up, anger flashing in them. "Didn't know? That's your excuse. You arrested someone without any real reason, and now you're telling me you didn't even check who she was." Reed shifted uncomfortably. "We thought she was acting suspicious." She hesitated at a stop sign. The chief let out a short, humorless laugh. "A stop sign? That's all you had? Do you even hear yourselves right now?" Carter looked down at his boots, avoiding eye contact. He knew there was nothing they could say to fix this. The damage was already done. The chief exhaled sharply. "Let me tell you what's about to happen. The mayor is going to call a press conference. This entire town is going to find out what you did. You think this will just go away? It won't. The public will demand answers. And believe me, your names will be the first ones they mention." Daniels felt his stomach drop. He had handled tough situations before, but this was different. He had arrested powerful people before, but never someone who could destroy his career with a single statement. "Sir, is there anything we can do?" he asked hesitantly. The chief shook his head. "No, this is out of my hands now. The mayor will decide how she wants to handle this." At that moment, the phone at the front desk rang loudly, making everyone jump. The young officer picked it up. His face paled as he listened. Then, he slowly lowered the receiver and looked at the chief. "It started," he said in a shaky voice. "The mayor is speaking to the press right now." The chief let out a heavy sigh and motioned for everyone to follow him. "Come on," he said. "Let's see just how bad this is going to be." They hurried into the break room, where a small television was mounted on the wall. A news broadcast was already in progress. The screen showed the mayor standing outside City Hall, surrounded by reporters and cameras. She looked composed, her face serious but calm. The city officials stood behind her, their expressions grim. A reporter's voice came through the speakers. "Madam Mayor, can you confirm that you were arrested tonight?" The mayor nodded. "Yes," she said firmly. "Earlier this evening, I was pulled over and taken into custody by 3 officers from this town's police department. I was not informed of any clear reason for my arrest. I was not read my rights, and I was held in a cell without cause." The station break room was so quiet that even the sound of breathing felt loud. The officers watching the screen felt their stomachs tighten. Another reporter spoke. "Do you believe this was an abuse of power?" The mayor's gaze was steady. "I believe this was an example of why accountability in law enforcement is necessary. No one, no matter their title or status, should be treated unfairly. What happened to me tonight happens to others who do not have the power to speak up. I intend to make sure this is addressed." Daniels clenched his fists. He could already see where this was going. The mayor wasn't just talking about herself. She was about to turn this into something much bigger. The chief turned to Daniels, Reed, and Carter, his expression dark. "I hope you're ready," he said, "because this is just the beginning." The station was filled with tension as the press conference continued on the television screen. Every officer watching knew that this wasn't going to end quietly. The mayor wasn't just making a statement. She was making sure the entire town knew what had happened. Daniels, Reed, and Carter stood frozen, their faces pale. They had thought this was just another routine stop, but now it was turning into the biggest scandal of their careers. The chief turned off the television and faced them. His voice was low but firm. "You 3 better prepare yourselves. There will be an investigation, and I can tell you right now, it won't be pretty." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Chief, we didn't mean for this to happen. We were just doing our job." The chief's eyes narrowed. "Your job? Tell me, what crime did she commit?" Reed opened his mouth but hesitated. He knew they had nothing solid, just a simple traffic stop that turned into an arrest for no real reason. The chief shook his head. You didn't follow protocol. You didn't verify her identity. And now you've put this entire department under a spotlight. Carter spoke up, his voice quieter than usual. What happens next? The chief sighed and ran a hand over his face. First, there will be an internal review. The mayor has every right to file a complaint. And considering who she is, this won't just stay local. The media won't let this go. Daniels felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had been an officer for years, but he had never faced a situation like this. He knew that once the public got involved, it would be nearly impossible to escape the consequences. The phone at the front desk rang again, breaking the silence. The young officer picked it up and listened carefully. After a few seconds, he turned toward the chief. Sir, City Hall just called. They want an official response from the department. The chief exhaled sharply. Of course they do, he muttered. Then he looked at Daniels, Reed, and Carter. Go home. Now. Until further notice, you're all suspended. Daniels' head snapped up. Suspended? You're lucky it's not worse, the chief said. Trust me, this is far from over. Get out of my sight before I change my mind. Without another word, the three officers turned and walked toward the exit. The station, once a place where they felt in control, now felt suffocating. As they stepped outside, cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions at them. Officer, do you have anything to say about the mayor's arrest? Do you regret your decision? Were you aware of her identity? Daniels lowered his head and pushed through the crowd, ignoring the voices around him. He had never been on this side of the news before, and he didn't like it. As he reached his car, he gripped the steering wheel tightly. This was supposed to be just another shift, another routine night. But now, everything had changed. And deep down, he knew things would never be the same again. The sun had barely risen, but the news was already everywhere. Every television channel, radio station, and social media platform was talking about one thing: the mayor's arrest. Daniels sat in his living room, staring at the screen. His coffee sat untouched on the table, growing cold. He had been an officer for years, but he had never been in a situation like this. The news anchor's voice filled the room. In a shocking turn of events, the mayor was wrongfully arrested last night by 3 officers who failed to recognize her identity. This incident has sparked outrage, with many calling for a full investigation into the police department's practices. Daniels sighed and rubbed his face. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages. Some were from coworkers, some from family, and a few from people he barely knew. Most of them were asking the same thing. What happened? He had no answer. Across town, Reed and Carter were dealing with the same situation. Carter's phone wouldn't stop ringing, while Reed's wife sat beside him, shaking her head. "This is bad," she whispered. "Really bad." Reed didn't respond. He already knew that. Meanwhile, at City Hall, the mayor sat in a meeting room, surrounded by advisors. A lawyer spoke firmly. "You have every right to press charges, Madam Mayor. This was an unlawful arrest." She remained silent, thinking. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. This wasn't just about her. It was about how easily people could be treated unfairly for no reason. A senior advisor leaned forward. "The public is behind you. If you want to push for action, now is the time." The mayor finally spoke. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want change." The room fell silent. She continued, "If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. I want the department to take accountability. I want new training programs, better policies, and real consequences for officers who don't follow the law." Her advisors nodded. One of them added, "We can demand a meeting with the police chief today." She agreed. "Set it up." Back at the police station, the chief was already dealing with the pressure. Calls from city officials, reporters, and even state authorities were flooding in. He had spent the morning preparing for damage control, but he knew this wasn't something he could cover up. When the call came in from City Hall requesting a meeting, he didn't hesitate. "Tell them I'll be there." A few hours later, the chief walked into the mayor's office. The room was filled with people, advisors, legal experts, and media representatives waiting outside. He could feel the weight of the situation. The mayor sat at the head of the table. She met his gaze, calm and composed. "Let's talk," she said. The chief took a deep breath and sat down. He knew this wasn't just about an apology. This was about change. And whether he liked it or not, it was coming. The meeting room was silent for a moment. The police chief sat across from the mayor, his hands clasped together on the table. He had handled many difficult situations in his career, but this was different. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about trust, about the way the department operated, and about the people who had lost faith in the system. The mayor looked at him calmly. "Chief, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make sure something like this never happens again." The chief nodded. "I understand, Madam Mayor." She leaned forward slightly. "I want real changes. I want new training programs, clear rules for officers, and a system that holds them accountable when they act without reason." The chief exhaled. He knew this wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback from some officers, complaints from the union, and challenges from people who resisted change. But he also knew the department's reputation was on the line. He looked her in the eye. "We'll do it." The mayor nodded. "Good. I also want a public statement from the department, taking responsibility for what happened." The chief hesitated for a moment, then finally agreed. "You'll have it." The next day, the police department held a press conference. The chief stood in front of the cameras, reading from a prepared statement. "We acknowledge that a serious mistake was made. The arrest of Mayor Johnson was unjust and should never have happened. As a department, we take full responsibility. Effective immediately, we will implement new training programs, review our policies, and ensure that all officers uphold the highest standards of professionalism and fairness." The reporters fired questions, but the chief kept his answers clear and direct. He knew the department had to rebuild trust, and this was only the beginning. Across town, Daniels, Reed, and Carter watched the press conference from their homes. Their suspension remained in place, and they didn't know what would happen next. Daniels sighed, knowing his career might never be the same again. But deep down, he also knew something important. This situation had forced change. It had exposed flaws in the system, flaws that needed to be fixed. At City Hall, the mayor watched the press conference as well. One of her advisors turned to her. "Do you think they'll follow through with their promises?" The mayor's gaze remained on the screen. "They have no choice," she said. "The people will make sure of that." As the days passed, the town began to see changes. New training sessions were announced. Officers were required to attend workshops on proper procedures, and a community oversight board was created to review complaints against the police. The mayor had not just fought for herself. She had fought for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And now, because of one incident, real changes were happening. For some, it was a difficult lesson. For others, it was a step toward justice. And for the town, it was a moment that would not be forgotten.